Greetings from Great Barrington, Massachusetts. I'm Karen Christensen, talking to colleagues around the world about topics that I write about at Karen's Letter. We often talk about books. Sustainability is always a focus. I latched onto this saying, think globally, act locally, when I was very young, and it sums up what you'll find at this podcast about the way we live now. Susan, hello. It's great to see you, talk to you, because you've been a name on my register for many, many years. I was just looking to see what you'd written for the Encyclopedia of China, and you wrote on social values. So this ties in. Now we're going to talk about schoolishness.
Well, thanks, Karen, for having me. Yeah, I didn't realize you were on this new project, and you probably didn't realize I was on this new project. And here we are, converging.
Yes. Yeah. Perfect. And, this is the questions about education have been something that have been on my mind from the time I was actually a very small child. But I didn't know you were working on this. You're an anthropologist and you're a China expert. So tell us, how on earth did you become someone who is coming up with all these new ideas about how we should approach education?
Well, yes, I have a story, but also these new ideas are not all so new. They've been around a long time. I'm actually finishing up a piece that's kind of detailing some of the precursors to what I've been working on. But I began my graduate work studying ethnicity, nationalism, and language in China. And I was interested particularly in how the ethnic majority group, Han Chinese, thought about ethnic minorities. And one of the puzzling things for me, and this is kind of step one, going from field work to new questions, was a lot of the Han Chinese spoke disparagingly about ethnic minorities who were simple and honest. And that was in contrast to a value that they called cleverness, being 聪明. And it didn't quite match with my American idea where we are supposed to be blunt and to speak the truth from our heart and not worry about the consequences. And the values in China were quite different. The values which are principled have to do with things like protecting people's feelings and protecting people's face. And so it was a very moral question, but the practices were sort of the reverse of how an American would think about it. And so as an anthropologist, that was interesting to me. So my second project, which emerged from the first, was to think more about how people in China and then also outside China think about truth and deception. So I'm trained in linguistic anthropology. This is clearly an ethical and moral question. And in that book, I have a couple pages about cheating in the civil service examination and plagiarism, which people at the time were saying people in China engage in plagiarism all the time. And that led me to notice, people in the United States are also talking about this. I don't know that much about it, but part of the inspiration for some of what I've worked on is psychological anthropology. And there was a lot that I've been teaching. I had been teaching about childhood and socialization. And that led me to wonder, what is going on around me? What is going around to socialize our students into thinking either that they can plagiarize, shouldn't plagiarize, that they don't.
Oh, how interesting.
What is it that they're trying to accomplish? What are the goals in education? And that coincided with a time in my own teaching that was not working very well. And as someone who had been, and I confess to this in all subsequent writing, I had been a true believer in conventional education.
And you were teaching then at Notre Dame?
I had been teaching elsewhere before, but
Mhm.
by then, when this was coming up, I was teaching here, and people were talking all the time about how great our students were and
Mhm.
how amazingly skilled they were. And also in the classroom, I was having a kind of not joyous experience. I
Mhm.
couldn't quite connect with the students. I had been at a place that was much more diverse before I'd
Mhm.
come here, but it occurred to me that I really didn't understand them. And so, taking an anthropological approach, I began to do field work here around,
Mhm.
which is a very typical move for anthropology.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If in doubt, do field work.
Right. But also I recruited undergraduates to interview other undergraduates because I wanted to learn about values having to do with honesty and cheating and the whole nature of education. Why were they here? What were they trying to accomplish? And how did they think about originality? And
That was what I was gonna ask you. I was gonna say that's something that's come up a lot in my work. Yeah.
yeah, so the question of originality and authorship is a cultural question, and it's a
Mm.
question that has a lot of interesting contrasts between, let's say, Anglo-American values and Chinese values
Yeah.
of being a kind of channel for a model or an authority, as opposed to the American, especially, celebration of originality. You know, if you're 18 years old, you're supposed to say something that nobody has ever said before, which is so hubristic. But
Yes.
that is kind of what we're asking. And also at the same time, highly accomplished, high achieving students have then seen their goal in school as achievement, as getting a good grade. So that's where I began to really read about and learn about and question the goals of college. What
Mhm.
is the point of it? Is it to get a credential? Is it to learn? Is it to have fun? What is the balance between the social and the academic and the career and the financial dimensions of
Mhm.
education? And that led me to really question almost everything I had always assumed. And
Uh-oh.
and right, I've really had a kind of conversion experience, and it's taken 20 years. You know, I am not the teacher, I am not the person I was 20 years ago. And my class, so I began to question everything, including the centrality of grades. So I've
Mhm.
also written about something that I and others call ungrading. Before that, I had a book. So the plagiarism book came out in 2009. It's called My Word, Plagiarism and College Culture. And then after that, I kept wondering what's going on. How are we teaching? Why are students not learning the things we think we're teaching them? And so I began to really read about pedagogy.
Mhm.
And that took me, of course, to all the classical works in unschooling and self-directed education and progressive education and, you know,
Mhm.
and some of
Dewey, Holt, I don't know who those are the
all of
names.
them.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so then my next book was where I looked at the role of schooling, and then I looked at the role of learning. And anthropologists know a lot about learning in humans in
Mhm.
general, which doesn't match the way we tend to do things in school. So, from an interview with a student, I got the title of my next book, which is I Love Learning, I Hate School, an anthropology of college. And if you had told me 20 years earlier that I would ever write such a thing, I would have
Mhm.
believed you. But I began to see it. And the title of that book alone evokes a lot of knowing, understanding from students, from their parents, stuff like that. Students know that school is not only about learning, it's also about suffering. And
Mhm.
so then I kept going and going. And so I've recently published a book called Schoolishness, Alienated Education and the Quest for Authentic, Joyful Learning. And the key concepts in this book really, which is all about the intertwined structures that we take for granted, but the key concepts have to do with authenticity, which is what we seek, and alienation, which is what people often experience. And so my classes are way more fun than they used to be. I don't feel like I'm fighting my students or checking on them or distrusting them.
What are you teaching? What are your course subjects right now?
Well, this semester I'm teaching a class called The Culture of College, which makes perfect sense given what I'm talking about. And I have also been trained in linguistic anthropology, and so the other class is a kind of version of a new media class that I started. I've just been looking up some of the old stuff. I taught it for the first time in 2010 when there weren't even really smartphones, and the newest technology was a tablet, the iPad, and people had the thing with the music,
iPods.
pods. And, that was all new, and people were still on like AIM, instant
Oh, yeah. Oh, the good old
but
days.
that's not that long ago. So anyway,
Yeah.
so the class, I rebranded it and retooled it, and it's now called Zoom Text Talk Insta Sing Chat, Modalities and Media of Interaction. So we start with the origin of spoken language, and then we're going, which we're doing sort of right now, and conversational synchrony and what happens when you're actually involved in a conversation, which is why I'm so glad you got your camera to work so that I can see you.
Because this is better, isn't it?
It is
Even though
better.
it's just a podcast, it's just audio that's recorded.
Yeah, but I want to see your nods, and I want to see your gestures, and I am a very gestury person, so maybe that helps with me too. And so then we're going to talk about writing, then we're going to talk about printing, then we're going to talk about the telegraph and, photography and movies and TV and radio, and then we're going to talk about new media at the end. So those are some of the things I teach. I teach a class. I teach basic linguistic anthropology. I teach the anthropology of childhood and education. And then I have this very substantial side interest in food and sustainability. And so I teach that too. So,
well, okay. My cup of tea. When you look at education, I mean, you started by thinking about the college students, but obviously education starts pretty much almost at birth. Babies, start learning immediately. And one of the things I've always thought is, you're around any very small child, they are endlessly curious. Endlessly. They love learning. They want to know everything. And then you get to school.
Yeah. There's research that shows that with every year of schooling, curiosity diminishes, or at least the expectation that school has anything to do with curiosity diminishes. So in some of my classes, we begin with just sort of brainstorming questions. What question can you care about? And they think it's very strange because increasingly more and more and more, and this really hurts my soul, students feel that the entire focus of school is to be judged. And what that means is they have to produce whatever the teacher wants. And their own interests, their own desires are incidental. And they've been taught to find out, what do you want? Is this right? Is this okay? And so one of my goals in teaching is to restore a little bit of that playfulness and the freedom to be curious, which is part of our nature as mammals. And in fact, lots of other animals also, not only mammals, lots of animals will forego food to solve a problem or a puzzle because they're curious. And as you say, children from their earliest days are just fascinated by the world, which is incredible. And they're learning, absorbing, often effortlessly, often without being taught.
Yes.
And so we kind of take this natural human endowment and we cripple it by
Mm-hmm.
by packaging it so that people assume that they have to be taught things in order to learn them. And David Lancy, an anthropologist of childhood, talks about this all the time.
Mm-hmm.
It varies cross-culturally. In some places, children are much more independent, much more autonomous in their
Mm-hmm.
learning, and they're expected to organize their lives so that they can accomplish what they want. But in our very schoolish society, we wait to be taught. And
Mm-hmm.
so
Do you think the trend, I mean, what has the trend line been over, say, even the last 50 years? And how does it compare to China? I've always been told that the Chinese system is more rigid, more kind of data numerical scoring than ours even.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the Chinese system, which produces incredible people, no
Mm.
doubt about it. And I, have many friends and colleagues who are from China, and I've had many amazing students from China. So I don't want to disparage the Chinese educational system, but it also produces some of the greatest suffering in the world around education. And it is, if Zach Howlett has a book called Meritocracy and Its Discontents about the Gaokao, the high
Mm.
school examination system that determines who goes to college, where you go, what you study, and all of that. And so the system is very uniform and very unforgiving.
Mm.
It's entirely academic, as opposed to, let's say, the US system, which, at least for middle class children, is about developing a kind of brand or a kind of CV that has all of this evidence of their character, which emerges from the sort of increasing democratization of higher ed in the US. There's the book by Karabel called The Chosen, where he talks about the Ivy Leagues trying to find ways to keep excluding Catholics and Jews because they didn't want them, but their scores were good. So in order to exclude them, they added things like extracurricular activities and so forth, which, our children and at least, I mean, my children were not, we tried really hard not to play that game about making everything they did about college admission. But if I talk to my students, the ones who have successfully entered this system where the selectivity rate is somewhere around 12%.
Mhm.
Everything they did in all of childhood was about amassing this kind of picture for the college admission process. And they consulted experts who guided them, take this sport and not that sport, and do this instrument and not that instrument because it'll look better on your application. But in China, none of that matters. It's all about
Mhm.
the test score. And it's gotten worse in the West, in the US, particularly in the last 50 years, because of of neoliberalism, because the economic system is so unforgiving. And so there is a sense that in order to maintain social status, you absolutely have to go to one of these highly selective schools. And that means you have to position yourself all the way through childhood. But that's only true for some people. Most colleges in the West actually are not highly selective. Almost
Yeah.
almost half of US undergraduates go to community college, which basically have 100% admission rate. So their goal is not selectivity. But for people who are aspiring to certain kinds of college experiences, there is a lot of attention focused on that. There's also in the US been increasing focus on metrics at the individual and the school level, with No Child Left Behind, and then Race to the Top and Common Core, and all of the testing, which takes up so much time and attention. But one thing I wanted to say about China and East Asia in general is I had a student from South Korea like 20 years ago who told me that the reason she wanted to come to school in the US was she didn't want to be part of that test prep high school experience. So she discovered, with the support of her parents early on, that she could go to an international school, which she found much more humane than the usual kind of South Korean school where they are in classes until midnight.
That's what I've heard from Chinese people, for sure, that they wanted a different system. Then they get kind of caught up in the American system, which has its own real challenges, actually, for a student who hasn't been brought up to this you have to do so much volunteering, and you have to and the whole personal statements thing, which is I think a really weird experience.
Well, it's a really weird experience, and it can be gamed easily, so that it's not authentic, it's not sincere. It is being crafted. Sometimes if you have privilege and advantage, then it can be crafted by an expert consultant,
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I know someone who has a very successful business doing that. And I know there are lots of people. And if you think about it, I mean, if you sort of step back from it and you think all these, I don't know how many, that tens of thousands of students write these every year. The idea that each of them is trying to do this blockbuster, 900 words or something.
Right, to set themselves apart from all the other 18-year-olds. Yes, it's a very strange system.
I remember my son, after his first year summer in China, he said, "Mom, I figured out why they have the system, the educational system." He said, "There are just so many people. How on earth could they manage if they didn't just do it with, the Gaokao?"
Sure.
And it's certainly difficult. So, if you started working and thinking about college students, but when does it begin? I mean, if one wants to improve the system, and for the sake of the future, I think we clearly need to I would say, to make some changes. There seems to be a lot of, I could kind of make a long list of the things going wrong. My biggest complaint at the moment is that I was on the school committee here for a few years, and I just endlessly heard about how we need to teach critical thinking skills. And I think, well, that was money wasted, obviously.
Well, critical thinking is, who could object to that as a goal? But if so much of what actually happens is trying to please the teacher and get the right answer on a multiple choice test, there isn't a lot of actual opportunity for critical thinking.
Yeah.
So where does that happen? I'm very concerned about the political situation in the country. And it seems to me that one of the things that we can do in our classrooms is to create a little hint of the world we would like to see. And so for me, that involves not just the cognitive, but also the interactive and social and relational, which my classes are not competitive. They're cooperative. There's room for diverse choices and diverse ways of learning and ways of presenting material. So I would like to see that kind of generosity and curiosity about each other broadened into the world around us. But when you say, like, when does it start? I think those people who are trying to position their children into the masters of the universe, Ivy League students going into finance or something, they begin at birth for sure. It used to be maybe Mozart and flashcards, and then for a while it was sign language and all these ways. As a linguistic anthropologist, I've written about something called the word gap or the language gap, which is a kind of fallacy about the fewer words heard by lower income children of color compared to their professional white counterparts, and how we need to basically introduce more words into the household. And you can get coaches who will teach you how to talk to your children. And basically this and that it's supposed to be done before the age of 3, and there's all this pseudoscience and all this. You can do brain scans looking at what part of the brain is lighting up when you hear words, and it's not very good science, but it's good marketing. And sometimes politics, because we like to have this deficit thinking that doesn't attack the structure or the system. We like to fix things at the level of the individual. But these upper class, middle class parents are acting like teachers to their children. So they're constantly quizzing their children. What color is this? Good job. What does this animal say? Great. What do you say about this? And so it's basically preparing their children for the schoolish world that they will enter in.
Isn't it making an assumption about the child, though, that the child won't do any of this learning if the parent... It's making an assumption about the nature of children.
Yes, and it's wrong, because we know from what linguistic anthropologists have reported that children will learn language without being taught. But what they're learning in these routines is how to please the teacher or the parent. And so I think that these are harmful practices, actually, but it does position them well for when they enter these competitive preschools, which will then allow them to test into these competitive K through 12 schools, where they will have all the resources and all the advantages so that they can write that great essay and get into the great school and have a perfect life.
And have a perfect life. That's the guarantee. What do you think about it would seem that it's routine for parents to do the homework with the child now? I thought, well, my kids would have been in big trouble if they'd expected that, because I never did their homework with them.
No, I've heard parents say, we have this homework. And
yeah, it seems to be common. I hear it all the time. Oh, I've got to, it's time to do so-and-so's homework.
Right. And that, of course, just increases the gulf between the advantaged students who have a parent at home who has the time and space and knowledge to do the homework with the child, as opposed to many, many other children whose parents are working several jobs, or they are being watched by somebody who doesn't speak the language of the school, or whatever it is. So homework, Alfie Kohn, this sort of radical psychologist who graced our ungrading book with a foreword, talks about the case against homework. And homework basically just increases all the advantages. If you don't actually know how to do something, you're not going to learn how to do it by yourself unless your parent is knowledgeable. And if you already know how to do it, what's the point in doing it? And it takes time away from all the other things you might be doing.
That a child will be doing outside of school. I mean, one of the things I wonder about, we hear about the 4-day work week and how people are just as productive if they spend less time, but it's more focused. I would have thought the same thing applies to children, to students.
Oh, sure. I mean, there's a lot written. I have a chapter in my Schoolishness book about time, and there's a lot written about time and how much time kids should or shouldn't be in school. And there's a lot of variation worldwide about that.
Yeah.
But, East Asia has some of the longest school hours in the world, where kids go early in the morning, they eat meals at school, they go into the evening with supplementary classes and stuff like that, as opposed to, let's say, Finland, where there's no homework and no testing basically at all, and a lot of emphasis on playing.
So very different, completely different approach. I've heard a lot of good things about Finland. I hadn't heard that particular.
Yeah, no, there's a lot written also about education in Finland, but one of the things, if you care about these international test scores, Finland does very well.
Yeah.
Even without spending their entire childhood preparing for tests, they learn this stuff. So even though the tests are probably not the best measure. But
now, to what extent are the long hours related to the parents working? Because the school issue, I mean, and we noticed this during COVID, was just the issue of childcare.
it's not entirely related, because in places like Japan, a lot of mothers are not expected to work, and they are expected to devote themselves to their children's education. So it's not only about mothers and parents in the workplace. Obviously, fathers or other parents can also be home, but the conventional understanding is that it's mothers' jobs. But it's not only about that. I mean, the US, we have this terrible lack of childcare. So many households, if there are two parents, both parents are working, school ends at 3:00, the workday ends at 5:30 or 6. So we don't really have a very good system.
Yeah, we're out of sync that way. I wonder if you would say a few things about online learning and about phones.
Phones, sure.
I thought you might have one or two things to say.
So online learning, I taught remotely for 18 months. So in 2020 to 2021, the second year was voluntary. I actually requested it because I have a spouse with a health issue, and I didn't want, and there were no vaccines, and I was very COVID cautious. And I learned with great effort to make my classes interactive online. But it was so hard. It was just so hard.
Yeah.
The breakout rooms and the Google Docs and all of the stuff that we were trying to do together that was fun. And but it's, if you're only taking what you do in the most schoolish way, which might be a lecture followed by tests, it's not that stimulating to do it online. But more and more and more people are doing a lot of work online. I mean, I remember one of my children was taking physical education online in high school, and there was kind of, it was like learning about health, and then sort of promising that you were going to engage in physical activity 3 days a week or something.
Oh, my mother was going to do something like that. I remember.
Yeah. So, a lot of things can be done, but you really have to think carefully about the goals and the modality. And if it's just delivering material in an unengaging way, then online classes can be deadly, but they can also be wonderful. So it's kind of a different kind of pedagogical structure. Well, as for phones, so they have been vilified a lot. In my class, we talk about moral panic, which accompanies almost every new medium. Phones are uniquely distracting, no question about it. I spend a lot of time on my phone. I want to check what's new, what's going on. They are giving us these little dopamine jolts, and we do like to be connected with people. So phones have a lot of influence on us in terms of our attention. And a lot of people are very concerned about attention. But they also can bring the world to us. There's so much they can do that we couldn't do before. Sometimes I talk to my students, and I'm pretty old, so I remember life before there were cell phones. I remember when there were phones connected to walls, and the only way you could talk to somebody, you would call a house, and you didn't know who you were going to get. And if you made plans with somebody and they didn't show up, or
you goofed. I remember missing a lunch with someone,
right?
Just because I literally waited on the wrong corner.
Sure. So that happened, and you would try to, if you could, you would go to a phone booth and see if you could get the number of the restaurant where they were waiting, and see if you could make a call. And there was that, but also it meant we didn't have to spend all of our attention waiting for the updates. I'm 5 minutes away. I'm 2 minutes away. I'm just up the corner. I'm parking, but there's a traffic. We didn't spend all of our time being elsewhere as well as present. And I think that's an interesting and problematic thing. I did an exercise in my class last semester. We were talking about school in my Anthropology of Childhood and Education class. And one day they came in and I had set up the classroom as a conventional classroom with rows and the teacher facing them. And I took all their phones and put them in a box. And I gave them worksheets and we did quizzes. And I could hear the phones going off. They were like, it was like they were alive. They were buzzing and beeping. And so it's a real challenge for all of us, not just in school, to figure out how to navigate this. And it takes much more self-control than most people have. So we need other solutions to it too.
Yeah. Well, finally, if someone has listened to this point and they're thinking, well, apart from obviously reading Schoolishness, but in terms of observation, because I'm thinking, and I do think about field work a lot. And when I work on third places and people say, well, how can I learn about this? Observation, look at what's happening. And how would that apply when it comes to education and learning?
And I love the third places thing. I do teach about it sometimes in my food classes, talk about, because commensality is the height of human enjoyment, right? So I try to teach my students to observe, and it's very hard because they're always looking at things through what they think they already know. And so often observing means unlearning first and then re-seeing. So one of the things that became very clear to me was looking at the negative effects of school in addition to all the obviously positive things too. Certainly students are learning things, they're getting into med school, their grad students are writing research papers. There is a lot. I don't want to come across saying that nothing good ever happens in school.
Yeah.
But if you start to listen to students, if they trust you, I have had student after student tell me, in most of my classes, I learn for the grade and I forget it as fast as I can. That's kind of an indictment of a system like this, I think. And if you really listen without judgment and you just try to see what's happening, I think it's hard to maintain faith in the system as it is.
So really we're saying that actually simply asking the question, thinking about, is this working? Is this doing what we really would like it to do for our kids, for ourselves, for the future? And that's what I'm hoping we do by having this conversation, to get people who might not have even given education much thought. It's very easy to think it's just the way it is, but it isn't, as you've pointed out.
Yeah.
It's great to talk to you, Susan.
So great to talk to you too, Karen.
Thank you. I look forward to staying in touch.
I hope we do.
Yes. Thank you for joining me at The Way We Live Now, a podcast where we roam the world for ideas and inspiration and talk about tools that will help to make the world a better place. I'd really love to have your ideas and comments. Please leave a comment below and subscribe to the feed. You can sign up for my newsletter, which I try to make a real letter, at karenchristensen.substack.com.